In this lecture, we're going to be looking at photography and different time-based media. Now, why we call this time-based media is you have to remember photography is linked with time, and it's the idea that it actually captures a moment of time. When it first developed in 1838, most people believed it showed the world as it truly was, that literally it captured the exact image. We obviously know today that's not true, and that photography can be manipulated in many ways. Moving images were first invented in 1892 with W.K. Laurie Dixon's and Thomas Edison's kinetoscope. This was actually the first continuous film motion picture machine. And what they did is they actually used film that had been developed by George Eastman, but for his own camera, the Kodak. However, this could be made for people to watch motion pictures, but you actually had to view it through a peephole, so only one person could watch at a time. The first motion pictures available to large audiences debuted on December 28, 1895, and these were created by Auguste and Louis Lumière, the Lumière brothers, and this is what was called their cinematography. And you're going to see later in the lecture, I've got a slide with different examples on it. And one of the examples is one of their short films. They often would create these films and they would create them, they would be very comical in nature. In fact, the clip I've provided for you is the one that's mentioned in your textbook where there's the gardener watering his plants, and the little boy comes and stands on the hose. The gardener looks at it and sprays him in the face. So you can look at that later on in the lecture. All right, but continuing on with photography. Photography literally means writing with light. The first cameras, if you will, that were created, what's called the camera obscura. And this is definitely not a camera as we think of today. This was not a portable object. In fact, it was actually a darkened room with a small hole on one side, and the room is light tight except for this small hole. This small hole admits a ray of light that projects a scene. The scene is upside down, and it projects it directly across from the hole onto some sort of semi-transparent, usually coarse fabric. Think about, remember when, in elementary school, if there was eclipse and you made out of cereal boxes or oatmeal containers, that's a camera obscura. Now, this was used because people could view things such as eclipses without trying to stare at the sun. The problem was the image could not be preserved. Well, William Henry Fox creates what's called photogenic drawing, and what he discovered was that he could fix negative images on paper that were coated with the light-sensitive chemicals. And then around the same time in France, we have the daguerreotype, which has been invented. This was invented by the two men. It was named after one of them because, sadly, one had died before the process was completed. And what happens in the daguerreotype is it actually yields a positive image on a polished metal plate. Now, it did have some disadvantages. It usually took very considerable length of time to prepare for the exposure and then to develop on the plate. And your book talks about this. In fact, there's an image that they show using the daguerreotype where it's an entire scene of a city, but you only can see two men in it, and it's a shoe shiner and somebody getting their shoe shined because they're the only two who remain in place for long enough to actually be picked up on the metal plate. Also with the daguerreotype, the metal plate could not be reproduced, so it only created a single image. Now, because of this, though, photography quickly began to replace painting as the preferred medium for portraiture. What also made photography so popular was because it wasn't only for the upper classes. The middle classes and then even some of the lower classes could save their money and get their portraits created. Now, interesting enough, people tend to think when we look at the older images, they're like, man, everyone looks so mean and so mad. Well, that was because of how long you had to sit for the exposure. You could not move at all. If anybody moved, they would become blurry and the image would be ruined and distorted. All right. The text then goes on and talks about some different advancements in photography process. We have the calotype process. This actually began to use paper instead of a metal plate. It was quicker, and for this one we could create multiple images, and this process becomes the foundation for modern photography. In 1850, Frederick Archer introduces the wet plate collision photographic process. And what this uses, this is actually a liquid-based system of development, and you develop the images in the darkroom. In 1862, photography was legally given the status of art. Now, the idea was that it still captures the world as it is, but we began to see this change. And we see this very clearly in Matthew Brady's images of the Civil War. This was one of the first wars, the Crimean War, and then the Civil War was one of the first wars where we had photojournalists develop. The idea with a photojournalist is they were to go in and photograph what was going on and then share it to the world. Now again, this original idea was that these were showing what really happened and how things were. But we know that often these images were staged, meaning in the image we see here from the school of Matthew Brady is they would often move the bodies, and then in the background where we see the people on the horse and the two individuals standing, they were probably also staged. Because remember, again, the development or the process time still is a little bit lengthy. This isn't just like a snapshot. And so those individuals would have to have stood there for a considerable length of time. All right. Now we also see within this idea of photography is the ability to make the everyday into art, to reveal the often overlooked beauty of the routine. And we're going to see that in the next couple of images. This image is by Alfred Stieglitz, who it's Steerage 1907. And what Stieglitz believed was he believed in what's called straight photography, which means there is no manipulation in the dark room and no manipulation. You don't stage the images. What was important to him was how the photographer actually composed the shot. And that is what creates the art within the image. And you see that here. He's on a ship, right? He is on a ship or he's on a dock looking into a ship. And it's how he's composed this shot. With taking, the stack that goes to the left, we have the gangplank going across, the stairs going up, and then you see this clear horizontal line that seems to cut the people in this. And so you clearly see the upper classes on the top and the lower classes on the bottom. You can see this again in this work here. This is Charles Sheeler's work from the late 1920s. In this is actually Ford Plant, Crisscross Conveyors, Ford Plant 1927. Sheeler was actually hired by Henry Ford to go in and take images of Ford's factory, and his role was to make it aesthetically pleasing, meaning to find the beauty in the factory. And you can see in images such as this, he was definitely able to do so. This is very industrial, but from how he has composed it, right, with the strong diagonal lines and then the vertical lines, he has composed this in a way that we don't really look at it as a factory, but we look at it for its artistic value. And we're going to see this again continue in the works of Walker Evans. Walker Evans was hired by the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, during the Great Depression. And his job was to photograph those who were suffering the most. And the reason that he was to do this was to garner support for the New Deal programs from those in the North. And what he does, though, is he's able to show the dignity and the beauty in the everyday, and especially in the lower classes. And you see that in the image here, the Alabama Tenant Farmer's Kitchen from 1936. How he has composed this, we see that it's a very basic rural cabin, yet it's very clean, and it seems orderly and dignified because of all the strong vertical and horizontal lines within it. Now, we're going to start seeing more and more this manipulation of the medium, not only in photography, but once we get to film and video art and computer and digital art. And then just a couple examples of how you can manipulate images in a darkroom. What you see here, this is Ansel Adams' Moonrise in Hernandez, New Mexico, 1951. And in an image such as this, these are two techniques that developed in the darkroom, and it's what's called burning and dodging. What happens in dodging is you actually you're having your photosensitive paper and you project the image onto it. Well, in dodging, you actually block out the light, so some areas on the paper become lighter. They're not overexposed. And you can see that in the village here. As Adams was projecting the whole image, he would cover up the bottom part of this. That way that village did not get overexposed. Now, the opposite is what's called burning, and this is where you increase exposure to light so that details are clearer and that areas will eventually become darker. So while he was dodging the bottom of this image, he was actually burning in the top half of it so it would appear very solid and very dark. Well, within photography, we have the introduction of of color film. Interestingly enough, color film was available in the 1950s and the 1960s, but it actually did not become popular until the 1970s, again with Eastman's Kodak series. And then color largely began to replace black and white. Nowadays, digital technologies have greatly replaced film. Why? Because they are extremely manipulable, and you can go in and on a computer and make changes, save all these changes. And it's much easier, well, I'm going to say easier, it's less labor intensive than actually physically being in a dark room dealing with film and and light sensitive paper. All right, well now we're going to move on to film. And what film is literally it's moving images. Now film can be edited through, manipulated through editing, and we're going to talk about some of the terminology that was covered in the chapter because it's important for you to understand the terminology to understand the editing. Most of these terms were actually coined by D.W. Griffith, who was considered one of the first masters of editing. All right, first we have what's called the full shot, and this is simply showing the actor from head to toe. Then we have the medium shot, which shows the actor from the waist up. The close-up, which shows the head and shoulders of the actor. And then the extreme close-up, where only a portion of the actor's face is shown. Then we have the long shot. Now a long shot takes in a wide expanse and usually many characters at once. We have what's called the iris shot. And this is where, think from older movies where it's transitioning from scene to scene. So your frame opens, you have a dark screen, and in the middle there's a light spot. And then it slowly, that circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you see the entire screen. And then it then closes. So we're at the end of a scene. And what happens is that circle comes back and that circle of light gets smaller and smaller and smaller until at the end we're at a black screen. Again, this was often used before splicing, where we literally cut and put film together. Usually this method was used to show we were switching from one scene to another. All right, the next term is what's called pan, and this is where the camera moves across the screen from one side to the other, giving the viewer access to the panoramic vista. From this developed the traveling or tracking shot. And this is where a camera is actually mounted onto something and moves along tracks parallel to the action. Other techniques that are often used is what's called the flashback. This is where the editor cuts in the narrative, and what it does is it cuts to narrative episodes that are supposed to have taken place before the start of the film. Often this is used to give the viewer background information. There's a technique called cross-cutting, and what happens in this, it creates high drama. And this is where the editor moves back and forth, meaning what the viewer sees, one thing then the other. So you have two separate events, and it flashes to one, then flashes to the other, flashes to one, flashes to the other. And the idea of this is that it gets an ever-shortening sequence. And again, it's to create this drama. And then last we have what's called the montage. The montage is where you have a sequencing of widely different images. And what happens though is you kind of go from one to the other to the other. And it's often in a fast-paced fast-paced, and it does this again so you as the viewer see different viewpoints, but it's also to add the drama to it. And now I've included a clip here from what your book talks about as an example of this. This is from the 1925 film, The Battleship Potemkin, and this is the Odessa Steps sequence. And so here you can see in this use of montage and how it's used to create the horror of this moment. Now, when this image came out, this film came out, this was considered one of the first horror films because it was very, very graphic for the time. All right, in 1927, sound comes to films. We have what's the jazz singer, where we hear the first spoken words in film. Now, what I've included on this slide, this has some different examples for you to go watch. As I mentioned earlier, the first is the clip from the Lumiere brothers. The next is from Méliès. It's A Trip to the Moon from 1902. Very popular, and what you're going to see in this one is we're going to see how we change from scene to scene. And this one will use that Irish shot. The next is a clip from Porter's The Great Train Robbery. And this is important because this was the first film that was ever spliced together. Before, we would have one continuous roll of film. So when we change scenes, you would fade out, then fade back in. So they would literally stop filming, set up a new scene, and then begin filming again. Well, what happens when a film is spliced together is literally the film is cut and then it's spliced back together. And because of this, you can change scenes without having to fade in and fade out. The next one is from Edison. I think this one's kind of interesting. Edison, when he first was showing some films in public, he actually filmed people's reactions. And so you can watch some of the first people who ever experienced film and their reactions are. And then the last clip again is from the Battleship Potemkin. It's the Odessa Stairs massacre scene that we talked about in the previous slide. All right, well then transitioning, we're quickly going to talk about video art in the computer and new media. Why? Because what these are more modern advancements on photography and on film. Video art became very popular because it was much cheaper than film, and there was this idea that it was more immediate. In fact, in 1965, the first handheld video cameras were produced, and they were relatively inexpensive. And what we mean by immediate was what's recorded on the camera is also usually simultaneously seen on some sort of screen. Because of this, there was this idea that video was more authentic than film, that it was authentically live, that what we saw on the screen was literally happening at that moment. And because of that, we seem to think of it more as true. However, we're going to see, and you should have learned from the textbook, that's not always the case, that video art can also be manipulated. So look at some of the examples in the textbook, and just remember, artists were taking this and they're experimenting more and more with the medium. And then we're going to see that even more in the computer and new media. What happens is we're transitioning into the digital world. 1975, the first personal computers are available for mass consumption, mass sales, and we're going to see it becomes cheaper and more readily available to more people to create this digital art. Again, we've talked about photography. Photography is almost completely digital now. Video art, excuse me, most of us on our computers have the ability to create and edit films. Heck, most of us have the ability to do that on our phones. And so what happens with this is it's a highly manipulative medium. Again, with the invention of CGI, computer-generated images. Think about Jurassic Park, right? The dinosaurs in there are CGI. They're literally created on a computer. They do not exist in any tangible form outside of the digital realm. Okay? And then what's an interesting thing is how the chapter ends. It's with this idea of the virtual space, and virtual space as holding artworks. An example of this is Phi's R&B City 2009. And what this is a digitally computer created. She creates all of this on the computer. She creates this artwork, which is this city. And how the viewer experiences is the viewer creates their own little avatar, and then they literally enter into the city. So they enter into and become part of the artwork itself. And so what makes this very interesting is that it makes it a different and very unique experience for each viewer, because how you go about the work is up to you. And it's also interesting, again, this does not exist in any tangible form. We can't reach out and touch this, yet through the medium, we can, in a way, in a sense, walk through and experience the art.